Hello students, welcome to this lecture on Directive Principles of State Policy. The Directive Principles of State Policy are, from now onwards, DPSPs are a unique feature of the Indian Constitution contained in Part 4 of the Constitution and covers Articles 36 to 51. They embody the ideals of social and economic democracy and guide the state in establishing a welfare system. The framers drew inspiration from the Irish Constitution of 1937, which had similar directive principles of social policy. Unlike fundamental rights, the DPSPs are non-justiciable. They cannot be enforced by any court. However, under Article 37, they are fundamental in the governance of the country. And it is the duty of the state to apply them in making laws. They reflect the goal of transforming India into a socialist, secular and democratic republic, ensuring justice, equality and dignity. The DPSPs supplement fundamental rights by defining social economic goals. Many believe, or in the initial decades of independence, it was believed that DPSP and fundamental rights are contradictory to each other, they are in conflict with each other, and the priority was always given to fundamental rights, ensuring civil and political rights, while DPSPs, just because of their non-enforceability through the court, considered secondary to civil and political rights. But that is not the case. They supplement fundamental right and there exists a complementary relationship between the two that we'll discuss in detail later. They provide the framework for state action in fields such as labor welfare, education, public health and environmental protection. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar described them as instruments of instruction to both the legislature and executive. Their inclusion ensures that political democracy is matched with economic democracy, the true foundation of justice envisioned in the preamble. Part 4 of the Constitution explicitly enumerates the directive principles. Article 36 defines the term state for Part 4, adopting the same meaning as in Article 12, including Parliament, government and local authorities. Article 37 declares that the DPSPs are non-enforceable in any court but fundamental in governance. So, as such, there should not have been any controversy regarding fundamental right versus directive principles of a state policy as it existed in the initial decades of independence. As Article 37 clearly mentions that though they are non-enforceable in any court but fundamental in governance. Article 38 to 51 set out specific directives to economic, social, political and international policies. These provisions taken together seek to realize the goals of justice, social, economic and political stated in the preamble. The DPSPs are sometimes described as the conscience of the Constitution. They guide Parliament and state legislatures in framing laws and public policies. They also serve as interpretive aids to the judiciary in giving meaning to fundamental rights. Many times there are gray areas or there is a tussle or the Constitution is silent on certain issues or there are new issues that emerge before judiciary. At that time, judiciary takes inspiration from DPSPs. The adoption of these principles ensures that India does not remain a mere political democracy but becomes a welfare state. They have been a source of social policy legislation such as land reforms, labor welfare, rural employment and environmental laws. The DPSPs thus provide the moral and constitutional direction for the state's long-term development objectives. The DPSPs possess certain essential features distinguishing them from fundamental rights. Number one, they are non-justiciable. They cannot be enforced by courts, as said clearly by Article 37. But they are positive obligations. They impose duties on the state to act, unlike fundamental rights, which primarily impose restraints. So while fundamental rights defines the don'ts of the state will not interfere in the personal liberty of an individual. The state will not deny equality to anyone. The state will not discriminate against anyone on the basis of caste, creed, sex, and religion. DPSPs demand action on the part of the state. State has to encourage cottage industries. State has to strengthen Panchayat Raj. State has to protect the environment, etc., etc. So while DPSPs are a positive obligation, fundamental rights restrict the jurisdiction or the sphere of activity of the state. Guiding principles, they guide all organs of the state in legislative, executive, and administrative functions. Dynamic in nature, the scope of DPSPs evolves with the societal needs and judicial interpretations. Comprehensive coverage. They span economic justice, social welfare, environment, international peace, Gandhian principles, liberal democracy, socialistic principles, and of course, governance. Complementary to fundamental rights. Together, they form the basis of the Constitution's commitment to a welfare state. The Supreme Court in state of Madras versus Champakam Dorai Rajan in 1951 held that DPSPs cannot override fundamental rights. However, later decisions such as Keshwanand Bharti of 1973 and Minerva Mill of 1980 recognized harmony between the two as part of the basic structures. Thus, DPSPs are not subordinate but supplementary to fundamental rights, ensuring balanced governance that aims at both liberty and welfare. Constitutional scholars and the Supreme Court classify DPSPs into three major categories. Socialistic principles aim to achieve social economic justice and establish a welfare state. Examples, Articles 38, 39, 39A, 41, 42, 43, 43A and 47. Gandhian principles reflect Mahatma Gandhi's ideals of self-reliant villages, cottage industries, and social harmony. Examples, Article 40, 43, 46, 47, 48. Liberal intellectual principles advocate individual freedom, judicial independence, uniform civil code, and international peace. Examples, Article 44, 45, 48A, 49, 50, and 51. This classification illustrates the multi-dimensional nature of India's welfare philosophy. Socialistic directives create the economic foundation. Gandhian directives infuse moral and rural character. Liberal intellectual principles establish democratic and humanistic values. Together, they create a holistic blueprint for a just and progressive society envisioned in the Constitution. Article 38 directs the state to promote welfare by securing a social order based on justice, social, economic, and political, and to minimize inequalities in income, status, and opportunities. Article 39 lists specific policy objectives, adequate means of livelihood, equitable distribution of resources, prevention of wealth concentration, equal pay for equal work, protection of workers' health, and childhood development. Article 39A, added by the 42nd Amendment of 1976, ensures free legal aid and promotes equal justice. These directives underpin India's welfare legislation such as land reforms, labor laws, and poverty alleviation programs. The Supreme Court in People's Union for Democratic Rights in 1982 held that equal pay for equal work is a constitutional goal under Article 39D. The Legal Services Authorities Act of 1987 operationalized Article 39A by providing free legal services to the poor. Together, Articles 38, 39, and 39A form the backbone of India's socio-economic justice framework. Article 41 instructs the state to provide the right to work, education, and public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, sickness, and disablement. Article 42 directs humane working conditions and maternity relief. Article 43 ensures living wages and decent work standards for workers. Article 43A inserted by the 42nd Amendment encourages workers' participation in management. Article 43B, added by the 97th Amendment 2011, promotes cooperative societies. These provisions together seek to humanize industrial relations and strengthen labor welfare, judicial interpretation, and etc. These provisions together seek to humanize industrial relations and strengthen labor welfare. The state has drafted a number of policies and laws in order to do the needful. Judicial interpretation and legislative measures like the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005 and Maternity Benefit Act 1961 reflect the realization of these directives in practice. They represent the Constitution's commitment to ensure socio-economic rights as foundational to human dignity. The Gandhian directives embody Mahatma Gandhi's vision of self-sufficient villages. Articles 40 directs the state to organize village panchayats as units of self-government. This principle materialized through the 73rd Amendment Act of 1992, introducing Part 9, Articles 243 to 2430. Article 43B supports cooperative societies for community development. Article 46 urges promotion of educational and economic interest of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other weaker sections, and protection from social injustices. These provisions decentralize democracy and empower rural population. The Panchayat Raj systems with constitutional status fulfills Gandhi's ideal of Gram Swaraj. The inclusion of cooperatives and welfare for weaker groups underscores inclusive growth and social harmony, central to both Gandhian ethics and constitutional socialism. Article 44 calls for a uniform civil code for all citizens to ensure national integration and gender equality in personal laws. Article 49 obligates the state to protect monuments and objects of national importance. Article 50 directs separation of the judiciary from the executive to ensure judicial independence, a principle achieved progressively in Indian administrative reforms. These directives fall under the liberal intellectual group of DPSPs, promoting national unity and the rule of law. Judicial separation strengthens constitutional governance, while heritage protection fosters cultural identity. Although the UCC remains debated, its constitutional inclusion reflects the framers' vision of common civil principles, ensuring equality and cohesion across communities. Article 48 directs the state to organize agricultural and animal husbandry on modern lines and to prohibit slaughter of cows and calves. Obviously, India being an agrarian society, there should be more emphasis, or the development should be agriculture-based. Article 48A, inserted by the 42nd Amendment of 1976, mandates protection and improvement of the environment and safeguarding of forests and wildlife. Together, these provisions form the constitutional foundation for India's environmental jurisprudence. Credit goes to MC Mehta for a number of public interest litigation and bringing admirable changes to the environmental jurisprudence. The Supreme Court in MC Mehta versus Union of India 1987 expanded Article 21 to include the right to a clean environment, thereby linking DPSPs with fundamental rights. Subsequent legislations such as the Environment Protection Act of 1986 and Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 implement these directives. These articles illustrate how DPSPs evolve with ecological consciousness, aligning India's policy with global environmental norms, or how foresighted our constitution makers were to vision the importance of ecological consciousness. Article 15 directs the state to promote international peace and security, maintain just and honorable relations between nations, foster respect for international law and treaty obligations, and encourage settlement of international disputes by arbitration. Maybe DPSPs remained highly neglected in the early 2-3 decades of independence or adopting the constitution. But if one sees the foreign policy of India, definitely these are the cardinal principles of India's foreign policy, wherein India always followed a policy of peace and harmony on the borders and friendly relations with the neighbors. The priority was always given to peace rather than war. And in order to maintain peace, many times India sacrificed its territory and a number of interests. But in the light of Article 51, perhaps, India had always been following a policy of maintaining peace and security both at our borders as well as internationally. The provisions reflect India's constitutional commitment to the UN Charter also and principles of peaceful coexistence. It provides the legal basis for India's foreign policy as said just now. The doctrine of non-alignment and peaceful resolution of conflicts are the glaring examples of these the principles enumerated in this article. Courts have occasionally cited Article 51C to interpret India's obligations under international treaties. It reinforces the idea that constitutional governance extends beyond domestic welfare to global harmony, integrating international cooperation into national objectives. Under Article 36, state includes all authorities of the union and state, ensuring that every level of government follows the DPSPs. Article 37 states that these principles are not enforceable by any court but are fundamental in governance, creating a constitutional duty, a moral duty for lawmakers and administrators. The Supreme Court has consistently held that though non-justiciable, they are mandatory in spirit. In the state of Kerala versus N.M. Thomas 1976, the court described them as the soul of the constitution. Thus, the DPSPs operate as moral and political obligations, influencing interpretation, lawmaking and policy direction. Their effectiveness depends on political will and administrative implementation, not judicial compulsion. The relationship between DPSP and fundamental rights has evolved through landmark judgments. If we start with 1951, the first case dealing with the issue was that of Champakam Dorai Rajan, wherein fundamental rights will prevail over DPSPs in case of any conflict between the two. In Golaknath case of 1967, again, Parliament cannot amend fundamental rights to implement DPSPs. So the superiority of fundamental rights was judicially ascertained or acknowledged. However, in Keshwanand Bharti case of 1973, one can see change, harmony and balance between part 3 and 4 form the basic structure. Now, 70s is a decade which is very, very significant. Go back to my first few lectures dealing with the basic concepts of human rights, and you will realize that the decade of 70s is very, very important, as this is the time when judiciary is taking a U-turn under the influence of a number of domestic and international developments. And therefore, judiciary is becoming very, very pro-people. And judiciary is now taking into consideration social economic obligations of the state very, very seriously, because this is the decade of resurgence of the human rights movement that was thrown on into the backbenches due to Cold War during the decades of 50s and 60s. Implementation of DPSPs primarily rests with the legislature and executive, though through policies and law. Parliament and state legislatures enact welfare measures, land reforms, labor codes, public health and education laws guided by Part 4. The executive designs schemes like midday meal, Manrega and Ayushman Bharat to realize social economic directives. The judiciary plays an interpretive role, reading DPSPs into enforceable rights. In Krishnan versus State of Andhra Pradesh, 1993, the right to education, Article 45, became a fundamental right under Article 21A. Thus, coordination among branches of government converts moral directives into tangible social progress. The 42nd Amendment of 1976 expanded the scope of Article 31C, giving precedence to laws implementing DPSPs under Articles 39B and 39C over fundamental rights in Article 14 and 19. The Minerva Mill case 1980 read down this amendment, holding that both parts 3 and 4 are essential to the basic structure. Later amendments introduced new directives: 39A, free legal aid; 43A, workers' participation; and 48A, environmental protection. The 86th Amendment of 2002 transformed Article 45's Early Childhood Education Directive into enforceable Article 21A. Though the practical implementation of RTE is in itself creating lots of menace for the majority-run institutions, as the obligation has been transferred only on the majority-run institutions and not on the minority-run institutions. They are excluded from the obligation under RTE. These developments show the Constitution's dynamic nature and the continuing efforts to give DPSPs practical effect while preserving fundamental freedoms despite all the odds, as just now mentioned by me regarding RTE. In modern governance, DPSP remains vital to achieving inclusive development. They inspire welfare programs addressing poverty, hunger, education, gender equality, and health, aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals of 2015. DPSPs guide budget priorities, social justice laws, and digital literacy initiatives. Judicial activism ensures their relevance. So, despite the fact that we have entered into LPG era, we have accepted the directives under Washington Consensus, and under LPG, liberalization, privatization, globalization, the welfare role of the state is constantly shrinking. But the DPSP has protected or maintained that welfare role of the Indian state. Environmental protections under Article 48A, transparency and legal aid Article 39A are now integral to governance. The directives continue to shape India's transformation into a welfare state, ensuring that democracy delivers substantive equality and dignity while ensuring development with welfare as well as sustainability. Despite constitutional importance, DPSPs face several challenges. Non-justiciability limits enforcement. Economic constraints hinder realization of social goals. Conflicts with the fundamental rights create interpretive tensions. Political priorities often delay social justice legislation. Lack of public awareness weaken accountability. So, though we know that despite the fact that 70s onwards, the judiciary has declared fundamental rights and DPSPs as complementary to each other, but still their non-justiciability still hinders their full enforcement. Besides, growing population, meager resources, uh, limit the welfare role of the state. With most of the public sector units closing, the resources of the state are further declining, and therefore, despite its willingness, it is difficult for the state to continue with the goal of social welfareism. Many times there is a conflict with fundamental rights, which still creates tension between the two. Political priorities are, of course, uh, closely aligned with the resources of the state. And therefore, the priorities are more of those which require less expenses rather than those which require more expenses. And definitely, social welfare policies and packages put immense burden on the state. Therefore, political priorities also often delay social justice legislation. Lack of public awareness, definitely. We need an enlightened community to have a full regimen of human rights. Besides democracy and rule of law, one of the important prerequisites of human rights is an enlightened community. Without an enlightened community, you cannot have a proper regimen of human rights. So, if we want development, if we want civil rights along with social economic rights, then definitely people have to be very, very aware, they have to be enterprising, and they have to take initiatives at many, many times, like particularly in case of environment. People have to be very, very aware about all these things. But lack of public awareness also weakens the accountability of DPSPs. Yet, the things are not decimal. Judicial interpretation has definitely strengthened DPSPs by reading them into fundamental rights. The Supreme Court calls them a constitutional compass guiding governance. It will show the direction to the state. To make the policies accordingly. Effective implementation requires strong institutions, resources, plenty of resources, and participatory democracy, which definitely requires enlightened community and very active role on the part of the people. DPSPs thus remain ideals still in the process of complete realization. The directive principles of state policy constitute the moral and philosophical foundation of India's constitution. They convert the vision of the preamble, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, into actionable state duties. Definitely, morality, as we all know, is something which is very close to your heart and soul, and it is not always the law that leads to its implementation. So, apartheid came to an end in South Africa not because of less because of any legal action, but more because of the moral pressure and the moral and ethical commitment of W.G. Clark, who was a hardcore Christian. And a lot of moral pressure forced them to do away with the apartheid. So, DPSPs are definitely moral and philosophical foundations. And definitely, despite being non-enforceable, their influence permeates legislative policies, judicial reasoning, and administrative planning. So, since they are moral and philosophical foundation, the quality of politics and the character of those who are in power, who are making the government, will definitely play a pivotal role in implementing DPSPs. The evolution from non binding ideals to partly enforceable rights, that is, education, environment, legal aid, etc., show their living character. We have transformed many DPSPs into law: equal pay for equal work, maternity relief acts, and a number of, child welfare rights, right to education, etc., etc. Together with fundamental rights, they form a balanced constitutional structure, ensuring both freedom and welfare. And together with fundamental right, they complete the regimen of human rights, wherein we need both civil and political rights as well as social and economic rights. As India advances towards inclusive growth and social justice, the DPSPs continue to serve as the North Star guiding democratic governance and human development both. Thank you.